evening. Our first speaker is Rob Sparrow. He is going to talk about appropriated partiality, human enhancement for whom?
Thank you very much. So I want everyone who's been in this room to kind of reset their brains momentarily and not think about moral enhancement. This is a paper about genetic human enhancement. So my primary interest in the enhancement debate is about the use of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and now perhaps the CRISPR-Cas9 system to improve our children by designing them in various ways. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is the way in which people's attitude towards what counts as an enhancement is influenced by their sense of the community that you should let into that debate. So, whose interests count when we think about whether or not a particular change to the nature of our children is an enhancement or not. Now, I haven't quite worked out the best way to say that. There's a sense in which I want that my current thinking is what counts as an enhancement is indeterminate until we've answered the enhancement for whom question. What is it that we're trying to enhance? So that first we need to identify something that we're trying to enhance, and then once we've done that, we can say what kind of modifications to our children will count as an enhancement. But if you prefer, you can think about this in terms of are enhancements good, or would we endorse particular enhancements? So I modify my child in a particular way, and then we discover that that's really bad for the society or the community, and then we might want to say that's a bad enhancement. So there's a kind of terminological question there that I haven't sort of fully worked out for myself yet. But essentially what's interesting me is whose interests count when we think about human enhancement. What sorts of concerns get into the debate about human enhancement and should play a role in our decision making about modifying our children. So I'm going to, in the short time available to me, I'm going to run through a number of different populations or people that we might say their interests should count when we're thinking about enhancement. Sorry, I'm just trying to set myself a clock here. So talk to time. Alright, so the obvious, well, there's a couple, I guess the sort of larger dialectic of the paper is that there seems to be two really good answers to the whose interests count. There's a third, which is essentially the parents and the child. And then there's another pretty compelling answer, which is everyone. So we need to look at aggregate consequences. We need to look at the impact on the world of these enhancements. And all three of those, I think, are actually pretty good answers to the question whose interests count. But then I want to suggest a number of what I take to be bad answers, which is the nation, the species, or the race. And the larger argument of the paper is it's very hard to move forward with human enhancement without people ending up making arguments that look very familiar about the enhancement of the race in particular. So that's the sort of larger argument. But let's just look briefly at the parents. So parents are the people who are reproducing, they've got reasons for reproducing, and so they have interests at stake. And on one way, one of the things I'm doing with these slides is I'm trying to point out that I'm not making this stuff up by drawing your attention to key pieces of the literature that essentially argue for each of these cases. Now, on one reading of Julian's original paper on procreative beneficence, the argument went, parents have reasons relating to their welfare of their children. It was the parental reasons that were doing the work for Julian. You want what's best for your children. Well, what's best for your children doesn't stop at the normal, so you should want enhancement. So on that reading of that first paper on procreative beneficence, it's actually not the welfare of the child that drives human enhancement. It's actually decision-theoretic consequentialism. It's the rationality of the parents. Take the parents' desire structure and point out that they should, in fact, want more than just the normal for their children. And if you're interested in liberal eugenics, then or reproductive freedom in general, then you put a lot of focus on the interests of the parents. What should we do with enhancement? Let parents make decisions about their children. Now, of course, one of the problems is that parents will often make really bad decisions for their children. They won't serve their children's interests. They'll serve their own private interests in their reproductive choices. And I guess I just wanted to point out that in some ways this is most obvious when you think about the desire to have your genetic offspring. Your genetic offspring are not the best children that you could have. Okay, you could always have somebody else's baby who had a better genome than you. Okay, you could say, I want my child to have the best possible genetic endowment. Well, I've got all these dodgy genes. You've got better genes. Give me your baby. That will give me a child with more welfare than any child that I could have. So you quickly see the shift to the interests of the children. And this is where I think most people want the debate about enhancement to rest. This is the kind of sensible, if you want to make a good argument for genetic enhancement of human beings, you say, look, we can make our children's lives better for their sake. Okay, we can increase our children's welfare by enhancing them. What's normal has changed. Why should we stop there? Let's have the best child possible. And the best child here is defined in terms of something to do with the child's experience, their openness of future, their expected welfare. It's not the best according to your desire set. It's actually what's best for the children. And the advantage of reasoning in that way is it enables you to make a really clear distinction between the old and the new eugenics. So what was wrong with the old eugenics was not just the sort of forced sterilisation and the death camps. It was that these people were trying to enhance a population. People were doing population, were trying to look to population level properties. We're not doing that. We're just trying to make sure that future people should have the best lives possible. Now, there's a complexity here, which is that if you're selecting between children, it's not really clear whether we should think of direct genetic genome editing as modifying an existing individual, or if there's some embryo selection going on in that process, as choosing who comes into existence. But the technologies that choose who come into existence have this weird property where they neither harm nor benefit those people. Because if my parents hadn't brought me into existence, I would not have been any better off. They might have brought someone into existence who had a life that was much better than my life, but my life wouldn't be any better off. So arguably you neither harm nor benefit through these kinds of selective decisions. And that will become important later in the presentation. You've also got this dynamic where it's pretty clear sometimes we want to say parental choices look like child abuse, and we need to protect children against their parents. And you see this in the debate about deliberately selecting in favour of parents. You want to say no, parents shouldn't be able to do that because it's not good for the welfare of the child. So again, you can read Julian as actually, I think Julian is himself unsure whether he wants to make an argument about what the rationality of desire, of what parents should rationally desire, or whether he's making an argument about the welfare of children. But you can certainly read this paper as being about the welfare of children. But as a number of people have pointed out, the same arguments that you make, if you actually look at the arguments in the original paper on procreative beneficence, they're kind of pretty thin and pretty basic in some ways. It's just, you should, as a parent, you should care about the welfare of your children, therefore you should have an enhanced child. And what's Douglas and Volder and also Jakob Elster have pointed out is that you can make a similar, when we're thinking about what kind of child we want to have, we also care about their impact on the world. Okay, we don't just want to have a child who has a high expected welfare themselves, we want them to contribute to society. So not only should we have the child that is the best child possible in terms of their welfare, but maybe we should start to look at social impacts. Maybe we should prefer altruistic or morally enhanced children for the sake of society. So you get this argument that not only should we be concerned about the child's welfare, but we should look at the welfare of the world, or the welfare of society, or aggregate welfare. Now, if you don't do this, you rapidly run into collective action problems. So collective action problems are where what's individually rational to do will generate an outcome that everyone conceives is bad at the aggregate level. So one of the things that I've been interested in recently is arguments about disability and diversity. So there's some disability studies scholars who want to say, look, the presence of people with disabilities in the community makes everyone better off. That a world without disability would be a worse world. Now, if you think that having a disability is actually bad for an individual, then you've got this really interesting logic where you say, for the sake of the world, for the sake of aggregate utility, you should have children's lives go worse than they might have, than children that you could have had. Now, we have to be a bit careful here because you can't say we can't say you're harming those children, but you might deliberately bring people into existence with a lower welfare than other children you could have brought into existence in their place for the sake of aggregate utility. We all benefit, and this has led me to explore the concept of what I call a genetic scapegoat, which is the idea that maybe we would all get a huge lift. Everyone in this room would be made happier if there was one person in the room who's incredibly miserable. Okay? Because every time we encountered that miserable person, we imagine them having a life barely worth living. So they're happy to exist, they don't regret their existence, but their level of welfare is much lower than the rest of us, and as a result of that, we all get a tremendous buzz. So thank God that's not me. I feel happy. I feel happy, and so total utility in the room would live. And that's a really repugnant form of argument, it seems to me. This idea that we should engineer our children for the sake of the world looks to me very problematic. And it's problematic because once we start thinking about aggregate utility, and once we recognise that the decisions that we're thinking about are not person-affecting, and so we don't harm people when we choose children with lower welfare, then there's almost no social order that you can't justify on the basis of a concern for aggregate welfare. That once we make this move, once we turn to looking at aggregate welfare, there's nothing between us and a fully great new world scenario. We simply say the world would be better off if the people who were sweeping the streets were genetically engineered so that they enjoyed street sweeping. We hadn't harmed them, someone just sweep the streets anyway, and we've lifted aggregate utility. So that it seems to me that you get some very nasty social consequences out of concern for aggregate utility. Now, of course, you'll also get this argument made at the level of the species, and when I argued that procreative beneficence required us to choose girl children, one piece of genetic selection we can do really reliably is sex selection. So we can make a big difference to the lives of our children by selecting their sex. I think one of those has got to be better than the other. It's either got to be better to be male or it's better to be female. I thought it was better to be female, and so I said, look, we should all select girl children. And almost everybody has heard that argument and said, hang on, that would be bad for the species. Humanity would go extinct. Now, I am sort of, and a number of people have now been arguing, look, it would be bad for the species to eliminate genes for disability, genes for impairments, because having genetic diversity is good for species resilience in face of pandemics. So, now I don't really care about the species at all. Common says have a child with a genetic disorder for the sake of the species. I'm not buying that. I care about individuals. I'm not sure. And if the human species was replaced with a post-human species, I might welcome that. So I'm not. But we see in here how once you make the sort of move to population level traits, you can resist some of the collective action problems, but now you're worrying about something that I'm not sure we should worry about at all, which is the species. Now, of course, in practice, if someone is worried about population level traits, what you have to do is resolve the collective action problem, and you resolve the collective action problem by legislating. You say you're not allowed to have a child here. You're not allowed to increase your child's welfare because that would be bad for the nation. So when we put this into practice, when we put concerns for aggregate consequences into practice, when we legislate, we will say have the baby that's good for Australia, or have the baby that's good for Serbia. And I hope you can see why that would be problematic. And then it's even more problematic if you think about the history of a sort of... Now, I know John is not arguing for enhancing the race, but I put his book cover up there because of the iconography of that cover that has a pretty clear political resonance. It's all too easy to see how worrying about the genetics of the nation, worrying about the population level genetics of Australia will generate the idea that Australians are a distinct race and we need to have the babies that are good for the Australian race. So I think that, basically, and you can read that as we were asking me, we're doing questions now or not? We're not. Now doing questions now. So I look forward to, hope that was something educational or entertaining, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Anyone? Come on, it was a good paper. Yes.
Peter Slovakia. I maybe misunderstood you. There's a negative connotation to the population point of view. All right. But I think we have like public health view. We have the view we need to go about the individual perspective. So what would be your question?
So, I think it is, particularly when you get the collective action problems, it is very hard. We've seen this for sex selection already. If you let people do sex selection, you get population level consequences that look straightforwardly bad. So I do think it's very hard to say we shouldn't take them into account at all. The problem is once you do start taking them into account and you understand that these are not person-affecting policy, individual choices or policy choices, it's hard to see why we shouldn't go straight to let's increase the genetic diversity of the population at the expense. It would be good for the population if there were more people with genetic disorders, if there's any worry about a pandemic at all. So it's the idea that we should sacrifice the welfare of our children for the sake of the population level traits that I think is really problematic. Now, if we're going to do this stuff at all, we have to take population level effects into account. Or anyone writing this literature, to avoid the sort of futile pursuit of positional goods and to avoid the aggregate impacts of individual choice, will say, look, we've got to make policy in relation to population level effects. But once you've made that move, it seems to me there's nothing between you and just a full re-engineering of society for the sake of aggregate utility, which is always going to be greater than the loss of welfare of those few individuals who are required to serve in the lower social roles. So it's, I don't mean this presentation to have solved this problem. I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that the combination of non-person affecting nature of the reproductive decisions and the need to take population level consequences into account means that distinction between the old and new eugenics in terms of, we're not talking population level stuff, that just goes out the window, and then there seems to be nothing between us and much more radical programs of social engineering.
You have to wait. We've got lots of other questions. Julia wants to first.
Yeah, so thank you for the brilliant presentation. I have two questions. One is more general, one is more specific. So the more specific one, I really like what you said about the collective action problem. But I was thinking, I think it's also a matter of context. So for example, about sex selection. We have, for example, in England, people were arguing for having sex selection for non-medical reasons, so parental preference, and it's not allowed at the moment in England. Whereas, for example, in the States, it is allowed, and people are arguably more often choosing female offspring. Whereas, for example, in India and in China, they had a problem with the children ratio because people were actually choosing male, and so they have more males than females. So I think that I wanted to ask, like, the collective action problem, I think is context dependent and what you think about it. So I think it's different. So I just mentioned these three countries, but I think for every country and every political system, we can maybe have a different interpretation of this problem or not. So this is my question.
So I think it's even worse than that. I think you can get versions of a Hawke-Stubbs problem, where what the rational choice for me to make depends upon what everybody else is going to do. So if I know, this is one of the things that Julian has argued in response to my arguments about sex selection. He thinks that it will be good to, if everybody starts choosing female daughters, that eventually the free market, sort of an invisible hand mechanism will step in, and suddenly it'll be good to have a son because it'll be so in demand, because it'll be unusual. But of course, the moment it becomes good to have children, then everybody decides to have a son. Okay, so now all of a sudden the population, that year everybody's born male, and then it becomes, rational to have a daughter again. So you can get, the collective action problems are actually you're absolutely right, they're social, but they also have a temporal dimension that makes it particularly difficult to resolve. Anyway, what's the second?
Okay, thank you. The second question is a bit more general, but it's related to what you said at the beginning, like enhancing home also. Because I think, can we say that reproductive technologies, for example, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, are actually enhancing technology, or they're just replacing technologies? You know, like, we're not enhancing one person, and you also mentioned throughout your presentation the non-identity problem of parties in general. We're not really enhancing them, right? We are replacing. I'm not saying that it is bad or good, I'm just asking what you think about it.
Yeah, look, certainly until CRISPR-Cas9 came along, and if you wanted to be serious about sort of, making people radically better, then it had to be done through biomedical means. It had to be done through genetic selection. So I'm not sure. I think if I decide to have a child who has above species typical traits because I've sourced a donor gamete from somewhere, and that child is much better than the child that I would have had, I'm inclined to let that in as an enhancement, even though I recognise that that particular individual who was born is not, I haven't improved their welfare. But I just think that's up for grabs, but there's an enormous number of people in the literature who think that if we all started having children who had above species typical capacities because we embraced the use of PGD for non-medical selection, then that would be a program of human enhancement.
Okay, looking at the time, I've got 5 more questions on the list, so stopping with this. And please keep it short. John, you're next.
Thank you. Nice presentation, Rob. Very short. Just on the point of information, for other people, I know you know this, but Julius Alberti did not invent the principle of propagated benefit in the facility, we really renamed it. If it was invented by anybody, it was probably invented by Dr. thinking what sort of people should there be. I use the same principle I do for very similar ways in two of my books, in Value of Life and in Wonder Woman and Superman. The other very brief thing is just on the iconography of my book, Enhancing Evolution. That's not a fascist, that's Superman. Unless you think Superman's a fascist, which there might be. I mean, anybody who wears the elephants on the outside of their tights is probably very suspect, but probably not necessarily because they're a fascist.
Okay, I mean, I'm not claiming you're a fascist, but this is straightforwardly fascist iconography. That just seems muscled arm in front of the rising sun. Its historical resonances seem to me to escape any authorial or even editorial intention, and that's a feature of the enhancement debate in general. Is what philosophers talk about and how this stuff enters public discourse are quite different things. Particularly as we can't do almost none of the stuff that we talk about you can actually realise in public policy. So the take-home message from all this talk about enhancement is that people are bad because it's in their genes, okay, and essentially poor people shouldn't be allowed to have children. I mean, that seems, and those are the take-home messages of the philosophical debate about human enhancement. Now that's not, I'm not sure what follows from that, whether we should stop talking about it because it will be misinterpreted when it enters public political debate. But people should be clear that what you say and what other people hear are very different things. And so all this stuff has political resonances that escape our intents. And this image seems to be a case in point.
Sorry. On the center.
So I was wondering about future generations as a target. So the reason we want to stop ultimate harm is that the existential threats to the human species might not be bad for the human species because there's nothing to be bad for people, but it's very bad for a lot of people, bad for future generations. So that motivation might lead you to a reason that you might want to do for ways to beneficial. What do you think about that line of reasoning?
I find the debate about population ethics incredibly difficult, to be frank, and I'm not sure what, as you well know, there's no answer to the fundamental questions about population ethics. That doesn't lead somewhere that you'd rather not go. I guess I'm really suspicious of the idea that I should sacrifice my children's welfare for distant strangers, I guess, and particularly if they're distant in the future. Someone says, look, this will be, if you have this child, that'll be bad for someone who's going to exist in 500 years. I find that hard to take that seriously. Now, I'm not sure I want to defend that, to the hilt or anything, but apart from the fact that they're non-person affecting, we can see the next generation, and we can see that we are harming, that we're increasing their welfare or lowering their welfare. And someone says lower their welfare for the sake of an abstract entity, be it nation or species or even future individuals. I think that will license way too much.
Eric?
I just wanted to point out, you said in passing that there are people with disabilities who want to engineer children with disabilities, and I'm sure that if you said it, you can find examples of it. My own experience with people with disability rights community is to recognize not that we should engineer children with disabilities, but that we ought to accept otherwise wanted children into the world. That is, we shouldn't select against disability, especially once there's already a wanted child on the way. In fact, and speaking of iconography, one of the reasons that many people with disabilities have been voted against the kind of organization is that the kind of selection against disabilities is a form of the selective mentality that harkens back to precisely what you were rightly worried about. So, I don't know, I hate to say that I wonder if the question isn't so much, is it good or bad on mechanics, but I fear that that's probably where I'm driven. You're defending a kind of shaping of future generations, which one could certainly argue is a kind of particularly good.
Right. I guess look, there's lots of different arguments against genetic selection against impairments. And so there's, people from the disability studies communities make all sorts of arguments, some of which I think are better than others. But there is a very familiar argument that says it would be bad for society. There's kind of echoes of this in the debate about moral enhancement, when people start defending the value of suffering as a learning tool. So they start saying, look, for the sake of society, we must ensure that there's human variation. And if you think that human variation correlates with welfare, and I do think that's disputable, but if someone says to me, look, we should make sure that there are some children who are born with crippling genetic disorders, which we all admit would be bad for them, but we don't want to prevent that because it would be bad for society if those people didn't exist, then that strikes me as a kind of instrumentalisation of reproductive decision making that we should be very disturbed about. Now, I agree the alternative is let's not do population level reasoning. I've conceded we have to do that. I'm just particularly worried about what happens when we start saying, look, let's not increase individual welfare because that will have a bad consequence for social welfare, because that seems to be to license an enormous amount that people simply don't write about because it's politically embarrassing. I think, we're not that many years. One of the interesting things about this debate is how quickly the literature has colonised all the available nations. Okay, so you start out by talking about let's just re-engineer kids for their benefit, and now we've got papers arguing that we should engineer children for the sake of the species, or we should choose children for the sake of the public good.
For the sake of the good, I will not follow. Thank you.
Okay, we've got two more questions. Again, keep them short and also keep the answers short.
Nice presentation.
From your presentation, it seems that the interests of parents are separated, distinguished from the interests of child and society. I am not sure that it is necessarily so. If parents can think that for them it's good to have a big child, and that this is good for the society too.
Right, well, I guess one of the interesting things is that most people, so take the British legislation to prevent deliberate selection for impairments. Okay, that looks like a sort of an interference of reproductive liberty of a sort that a few years ago nobody would have countenanced. The government is legislating to prevent certain sorts of people reproducing in a certain way. That's precisely an example of the sort of how swiftly we've gone from talking about reproductive freedom and talking about the new eugenics to legislation to prevent certain people from reproducing in the ways they want to. Anyway, if you have that intuition that to be born deaf is to be born harmed, and you think that some people will want to have deaf children, it seems to follow that sometimes parents are not concerned with their children's best interests. Now, it makes a difference here whether you think that there's an objective account of interests. I'm sure deaf parents think that it would be better to be deaf. You know, one of my, and this is where Julian will sometimes slide back to, let's just defer to parental choices. But there's lots of sort of, I think it's better to beat my children. Okay, this will be good for them if I beat them black and blue once a week. This will prepare them for adversity. Okay, but that's just gold use. And the fact that I genuinely believe that's good for them is not a reason for people not to stop me doing it. So clearly their interests, clearly the interests of parents and children come apart at least sometimes. Now, maybe less often than I've represented, but parents don't have their children's well-being, their actual objective well-being at heart all the time. We've all seen parents who have betrayed their children. All of us have, in fact, had our welfare sacrificed for the sake of our parents' crazy ideas at one stage.
Okay, that was not a short answer.
I'm blaming the coffee if
I agree there's something problematic about this claim that this idea of imposing harm on an individual for the sake of the species. On the other hand, I also feel worried about cases, for instance, of selection against specific ethnic groups, say selecting for white skin or against any other kind of ethnic minority or any other minority that's tends to be discriminated against in our society. So is there an alternative, more plausible justification for this type of worry that will build suspect norms or something else of this kind? And if so, is there an implication for public policy?
I think if there's any public policy conclusion, is that we should avoid offering ourselves these choices. Okay, there are some choices that once we have them, the only way to deal with them at the level of public policy is going to be something that we'd really rather not be involved in. So if there's any kind of public policy argument out of this, it's don't go down the enhancement path, because once you do that, you open up these questions. For instance, I think you're absolutely right. If there's, you do need to look to aggregate consequences. If the appropriate response to racism in the US is to select against the birth of children with dark skin colours, that in some ways seems to be, the history of the US becoming a post-racial society is not looking too good. But that seems to be obviously wrong. But again, if someone said to me, look, your child should be a victim of racism for the sake of the community, this will be good for America if your child is shot by the police. Okay, now I'm starting to think, I know what's good for America. Actually, I want my child to have the best life possible, and regrettably in a racist world, they're going to have a better life if they're white. So I just don't want to have that choice. I think we should resist the development of technology that would allow us to select skin colour in order to not have to make that choice.
Okay,
that's as short as I could be.
I think we need to practice that with the short answers. Okay, thank you very much, Rob. The next speaker is Ćirković, and he's giving a talk with the intriguing, very transhumanist sounding title, Enhancement as the Stairway to Post-Biological Civilization on Earth and Beyond.
I guess we get some vision there. Thanks. Oh yeah, sure. Well, okay, actually I wish to build up a little on two. I've heard many supremely clever things today, and especially two which particularly seems important to me and which I wish to build upon a bit. The first was a statement by Professor Harris in his keynote lecture that in his criticism of Patricia Churchland views, he emphasized that our future trajectory should not be thought about as determined or fettered to or any other number of evolutions related to our evolutionary past. And the second is one by Professor Sparrow, who said that he would welcome actually substitution of humans with post-humans or post-persons, and that there is nothing inherently important in the concept of a species itself. So actually, as General Eisenhower once said, plans are useless, but planning itself is precious. So I planned this presentation in a completely different way and manner, but some recent news actually motivated me to completely change it. The title itself is an allusion to a famous song, Stairway to Heaven, of course, where heaven is understood as a place of high, supreme, if you wish, moral value. So, in a sense, a question which I wish to discuss is something which we obtain by zooming out on usual perspective, and like you are doing this with a digital camera or something similar, you can try to zoom out, further zoom out, until you reach issues and questions like are there other moral agents in the universe, and especially in the universe understood in its four-dimensional meaning, I mean in both sense of space and time. Religious people of course think that there are, and we can speculate about other religions. There was a book by Roland Posetti back in 1969 which actually sparked the whole discussion about the relationship of what we now call astrobiology, or search for life and intelligence in its widest cosmic context, to ethics, because he argued that actually we should care about other moral agents in the universe. On the other hand, we could use wisdom of Dilbert, for instance. We could have accountants. Accountants are obviously completely different types of intelligent beings, which are obviously intelligent, but obviously, as Dilbert's own experience here shows, they don't really have the same set of moral concerns as we are. So, and now we haven't actually established the existence of any extraterrestrial life form or intelligent form, but recently there was an item in the news which motivated me to completely rehold the whole presentation, and which is this star. Probably you have read something about this in the news. This is a star in the constellation Swan. You can see here the star map, you can see here a little bit enlarged, which has obviously some very strange objects which are orbiting and transiting from time to time. And we have actually established this strange light curve of some huge and irregularly spaced objects which are orbiting it. And now, in all probability, I don't wish to raise anyone's hope too high, in all probability it is a new and unknown type of natural object, probably sort of a very dense, huge cloud of comets or something like this. But what astronomers have admitted so far, that there is no obvious natural explanation. And on the other hand, some of them, especially Jason Wright and some other very distinguished people, very professional astronomers, not some UFO buffs, have admitted that actually this is in agreement, light curve is in agreement with theoretical work on what will be observational signatures of extraterrestrial engineering objects. So if you have something which is larger than planet, dark, and which is irregularly spaced, and probably irregular, it may be non-spherical in shape, we still don't know that part, this would obviously tell us that this is at least a strong candidate for intentionally built structure. So, the question which I want to ask and to try to draw some ethical consequences from it is, for instance, this object a product of physical evolution or cultural evolution? In any case, it is a product of some evolutionary processes, but we can discuss and we can speculate, for instance, if this one is not really a product of cultural evolution, probably some other to be discovered tomorrow or next year or in the next century will be. There is plethora of philosophical reasons for belief that there are other places where evolution has progressed to the point of making a big impact on its physical environment. So actually, as we are worrying about climate change, for instance, we should think about climate change as an anthropogenic impact upon physical environment, which would, to a distant observer, indicate that there is something unnatural or intentional about our Earth, and maybe probably will tell such a hypothetical observer more than we really want about our capacity for building a sustainable civilization. So the issue here is that if these objects are, for instance, intentional, this again, take it as a thought experiment if you wish, this obviously points out to a community or species which is obviously intelligent, obviously possessing huge capacities of influence in this environment, and even more important, capable of solving coordination problems, because such a project would be a project which lasts for at least thousands of years, maybe millions of years. So actually to plan and to coordinate on the time scale of thousands or millions of years raises a quite clear question whether such civilization will be biological or post-biological. You can imagine all sorts of influences upon physical environment, all sorts of macro engineering artifacts which actually could be used, potentially detected from afar and used to sort of discriminate between products of physical and products of cultural evolution. Now, there is an idea which was in sort of a synthetic form formulated by the great historian and sociologist of science, Stephen Brady. He was for quite a while even NASA's official historian. In a paper in 2003, he argued that actually we should try to analyze scenario on that basis, on what he called intelligence principle. And he argued that the essential property of evolution is transition to sort of enhanced state. He said, for instance, that to the extent intelligence can be improved, it will be improved. Somewhere in the totality again of a 4D universe. Now you can imagine there is no sort of universal definition of what post-biological would mean, but some things we can reasonably speculate upon, mainly transference of at least part of cognition into mainly non-biological systems. And the thing is that, as Professor Harris emphasized, that means that the ways to reach this state are not really determined by biological evolution, but instead the processes of cultural evolution, including various forms of enhancement. This means a huge expansion, or if you wish, explosion. Often people in very recent years talk about it, the expansion, the explosion, or intelligence explosion, for instance, expansion of the design space. While both biological and cultural evolution explore pieces of a huge design space, it could be argued persuasively that design space available to post-biological civilization is much bigger in the sense of any appropriate metrics. Now, what we can also think as a sort of a reason, even reason why transition to post-biological state would be even desirable is leaving behind biological baggage, in the sense that those features which we obviously inherited from evolutionary mechanisms like natural selection or genetic drift or lateral gene transfer or whatever there is, like most obviously regression, but there are some other. There was talk today about genetic lottery and sort of avoiding genetic lottery in a sense of improvement or enhancement. And one major motivation, obviously, which we also heard about today, is preventing ultimate harm, in the sense that in order, for instance, to become a civilization, suppose that we are talking about the human/post-human civilization, but we could, in general, talk about any intelligent species, wherever and whenever. So, in order to reach the state in which we can impact environment or physical environment in such a big way that it is detectable over interstellar distances, as in this example of this Kepler's find, we obviously have to pass through a phase in which ultimate harm can, harm us. So obviously those civilizations which are capable, whenever and again, wherever they are, have obviously resolved these problems. But on the other hand, we should also be aware that transition itself to sort of post-biological state is obviously bound to bring instabilities. Also was mentioned. Now, suppose that we wish to sort of grade different civilizations throughout over the understood universe. There is famous, well-known in circles of SETI, Kardashev scale, which actually grades civilizations according to this went to the back. There is the type 3 civilization, which actually utilizes resources of the home galaxy as well as home planet and home star. And of course, if we turn inward to a microspace, nanospace, whatever, we have something which is recently called Sparrow scale, which is scale of manipulation of microscopic fundamental particles which constitute physical reality. So we can go from manipulating objects over scales of themselves or ourselves, if you wish, to manipulating objects like quarks and leptons and even maybe structure of space-time itself. And of course, we could in principle think of, but we haven't actually thought of building something like enhancement scale. This could be a sort of outline of a research program to see what outcomes and in which way outcomes of enhancement would be eventually ordered and scaled. By analogy, for instance, with these two examples. Now, any transition between such states, any transition could be regarded as analogous to phase transitions in physics, which are well studied but unpredictable phenomenon, and this is what I would wish to emphasize, because this is an important epistemological point. We can actually study in science quite objectively, or as objectively as possible, phenomena which are inherently unpredictable. And phase transitions are such phenomena. We all know that if you put liquid water and heat it to 100 centigrade, we could actually boil it and transfer it, make it transfer to a gaseous state. But which part of the liquid will evaporate first? What will be the exact dynamics of those bubbles which are formed, bubbles of a new phase which are formed within old phase? It is essentially unpredictable problem, and physicists gave up long ago on giving exact deterministic account of how phase transition proceeds. Instead, there are other global synthetic methods to approach this and to give a picture which is not really predictable, but which gives you some sort of a stable points or stable ingredients in describing things like phase transition. So, instead of conclusions, actually I wish to outline something which could be potentially a fruitful research program, and not really on astronomical timescales, but much shorter timescales, hopefully. And that is, the first one is to devote more time and energy into elucidating the relationship between enhancement, idea of enhancement, and the idea of post-biological, and in our terrestrial context, post-human evolution. And of course, this about ordering types of according to interaction of the outcomes with its environment, both physical and presumably social environments. And by the same token, which we understood the tempo and mode of biological evolution, we should at least try, or at least acknowledge difficulties in trying to account for tempo and mode of post-biological evolution as well. And again, study the impossible or to try to make quantitative models of transition. Again, I repeat it, in the very late 19th, early 20th century, studying of phase transition in physics was deemed impossible. Because at that time there were no global methods, there were no numerical physics as well, so people thought, oh, simple boiling of water was deemed too complex to be really understood. Nowadays it's completely changed, and the thing is that probably some issues which we consider too difficult, too involved, too complex, can also be studied, or we should be able to study them in a rather short time in the future. Saying that, I wish to thank you for your attention.
Right, any questions? Yes,
thank you very much for this great talk. This brings me back to the point of the actual anatomy debate being a kind of a scientific utopia. Because I think that is where maybe the impossible can be thought of. Mm-hmm. It can be developed models of what before was impossible to think. You can have alternatives of reality that we still have not encouraged, I think. And I think that's a very interesting point, because it's not just about, when I hear about the idea of selecting sexes, why nobody speaks about creating new sexes? Why do we always limit our possibilities to existing notions of categories? Why don't we invent new categories if we talk about them?
Exactly, and this example of yours actually reminds me of something. I mean, this example of yours is actually a proof. It's a sort of a counter example which proves the notion that the size of design space is equal or similar. Because actually there is a well-known proof given by the father of the modern neo-Darwinian synthesis, Ronald Fisher, who actually proved why in the course of biological evolution there were only two sexes evolved. So, in a state of, from the beginning of life on Earth, from the state of simplest prokaryotes, which of course did not have any sex, there was subsequent evolution which led to a present situation in which species have two sexes. Now, Fisher actually used a sort of thought experiment to reduce ad absurdum the idea that there could be 3, 4, or more sexes, because if such mutations occurred, actually he showed that they will be gradually, very quickly lost from the population. And the thing is that actually this is true for, of course, for biological evolution, but of course you are perfectly right that in principle it is a part of design space which would be available for post-biological evolution, and this is a very important point to keep in mind.
As a parenthesis, it's worth noting that we're actually some fungi that do have 13 sexes. But they're not particularly interesting sexes because they're mostly genetic rather than anything sexy. So my question is, if one assumes that there are intelligent species out there, and the silence in the sky is kind of making that somewhat problematic, but that would also imply something interesting. Assuming the one that has the right meta-ethical outlook, one would assume that advanced civilizations would actually have their ethics together. They would have had 1 million or 1 billion years of working on ethics. So there's an interesting hypothesis here about whether they would be convergent. And if you're intelligent life out there, it doesn't seem like any of the species are paving the universe with computers to run hedonic states, for example. That would be very visible, and a fair number of our theories would suggest that that's actually a good outcome. Except that if there is intelligence out there, that seems to speak against either it's not good for that kind of beings, or it's not a universal statement.
Well, that is a very interesting point, and I guess one should just try at least daily to see what kind of attractors are there in a space of to what can values of as defined various utility functions defined over the space of species might converge. So actually, this is, I guess, the thing is that one important point to keep in mind is that actually, as you said, that there is a sort of constraint which can be inferred from the fact that we haven't actually seen something like that either in our immediate vicinity nor in a general cosmological context, which actually offers much tighter constraint because we can sample much larger volume of physical space. Although one could argue again that we are looking at distant parts of the universe as it was in the past, because so if things like that occurred fairly recently, we won't be able to tell yet. We shall see. But that is actually a very important question, which of course impacts other bioethical questions which are posed, maybe more mundane in a sense, which are posed by the development of astrobiology in recent years. For instance, do humans have a moral right to, for instance, pollute Mars with bacteria? You all watched about all these successful Martian landers and probes. But in spite of the fact that they are sterilized before launch, but nobody has any real hope that they are completely sterilized. So some terrestrial bacteria went to Mars, actually, whether they probably went extinct immediately there. But on the other hand, even a very small probability could result in principle in a harm to a Martian biosphere if such thing exists. So there are many bioethical problems actually which are posed recently, although they are mostly limited to interaction of Earth with the solar system and humanity with the solar system. But of course, we will discuss other more, so to say, extended issues.
Another question on that? Yeah?
It is related. I'm not sure if I understood some points. For example, you emphasized it in the last part of this issue, predictability, and I'm wondering if you have in mind some normative constraints like precautionary measures because it's unpredictable. So this is my point, because you quoted Pascal in the end, so this is my mind. But my point is that if this is the idea, the problem, the importance of if this predictable or not, of unpredictable, in my view, if something is unpredictable, we should take it as a fact. I think the precautionary principle, for example, in several interpretations is completely insane. And there are several discussions about that in the literature, and we use in bioethics some people use this a lot, and I've written something about this, and I think my question is what is in your mind? If you're thinking about in extracting some conclusions that you should be severely restricted, constrained.
No, not really. I tend to agree with you, especially on this insanity part. I mean, so actually, I tend to agree with you. Actually, I think we need more boldness in tackling those issues. We shouldn't. Actually, this is the reaction. I talked about exactly due to the reaction of people similar to those which you mentioned, which are extremely wary and extremely reluctant, and even in some cases, openly afraid of discussing and considering and modeling issues which are inherently unpredictable. But unfortunately, the problem is that events which could bring ultimate harm are unpredictable as well. So actually, we don't know. At least we can say certainly for some types of natural hazards. I mean, the impacts of objects like comets or asteroids on Earth are also unpredictable. You can also, of course, you can map objects which are nearby, but you cannot really be sure that some objects from the outskirts of the solar system will not impact us in 10 years and cause destruction similar to those which ended the dinosaurs and other species throughout the geological history of our planet. And of course, this also with even greater force applies to those anthropogenic risks as well. So actually this would all be in Nassim Taled's famous saying, these will be all black swans, which are events of tremendous impact and very small probability per unit time. But we need to actually consider them. So I'm completely in accordance with your general tendency.
Any other questions? Then, thank you very much, Rina. So next and last speaker is Schermer, and she'll be talking about enhancement and the public good.
Okay, thank you so much. Indeed, in my talk I will try to explore a bit whether biomedical enhancement can be for the public good or whether it would be detrimental to the public good, and if so, in which ways. And it's kind of an explorative talk. So first, a presupposition, I think, in the enhancement debate, at least by proponents of enhancement, is that enhancement is somehow good for us. It's supposed to be a good thing. And of course, when you use a welfarist definition of enhancement, it's by definition a good thing for us. But also on more neutral definitions of enhancement, the idea is that increasing certain capacities or traits or performance will in the end enhance people's well-being or increase their chances of being able to survive. So enhancement is supposed to be good for us. Now I think that my feeling is that in much of the debate so far, the focus has been very much on the individual level of the good, the individual chances of being a good life, individual well-being. So, and I actually think that we should be looking, or it would be interesting to look more at what enhancement might bring us at a more collective level. So, a bit in line with the talk as well. So I'm thinking of things like doping in sports, cosmetic surgery, cognitive enhancement, better children, all rather individual enhancements. However, I see a number of reasons why we should take the question of what enhancement might mean, what effects it might have on a collective level, our collective chances for living good lives, more seriously. The first is that new biotechnologies actually affect all of us, whether we choose to use them or not. And by that I mean that even if we don't choose to use certain technologies, they tend to have an effect on everybody in society. Like take social media, for example. Even if you're not on Twitter and Facebook, social media have changed our social landscape. The same can be said for the availability of prenatal screening or prenatal screening programs that also affect opinions on people with disabilities in society, that also affect people who do not choose to use it. I think choices and decisions about new biotechnologies are not merely private choices. I think that's the main. Second, what is good for individuals is not necessarily always also good for the collective. A first example is positional goods that might create a kind of biomedical arms race where nobody in the end is really better off, but everybody suffers from side effects or risks. This is actually kind of collective action problem. Second example is that some individual advantages that are good for people may not be good for the collective, for the common good. So if, for example, parents would start engineering their children to be a bit more self-centered, a bit more ruthless, to get them to succeed in life, we would end up with a society of not so pleasant people that might be good for themselves but not for the rest of us. And finally, also a problem that has been mentioned more often is that, of course, if some people are better off, this may, but others cannot afford, for example, certain enhancements, this will lead to an increase in inequality and growing social divide. So these are two reasons. The third reason is that common resources are invested actually in research and development aimed at new biotechnologies. As the Dublin Council has recently argued, and also Donna Dickinson in her book me medicine versus we medicine. So if this is a common enterprise of investing knowledge and money and other resources to create new biotechnologies, and bioenhancements are biotechnologies, then I think we should also be fair that all of us should benefit and not uncertain. So that brings me to the next question. If we want to look at what enhancement might mean for something like the public good, and what is the public good, I must admit that I find it a very, very hard notion. I've been trying to find decent definitions or description, and I find it very hard. So I tend to now use it intermixed with things like the common good or the collective interest. And I've tried to develop a notion here that is kind of analogous to the notion of public health as it has been used or defined in public health ethics. So there's three aspects to this idea of the public good. The first is that it contains the sum total of all individual goods, so this kind of aggregate well-being that Rob also mentioned. So things that are good for individuals, you add them up and then they're good for the society as a whole. What is interesting here, I think, if you look at it from the more collective level, is the idea of positive externalities, that sometimes actually the sum can be more than its parts. If, for example, herd immunity in vaccination, in immune enhancement, then you could say if a number of people in a society have their vaccinations, then also people who have not been vaccinated will benefit because of this phenomenon of herd immunity. So sometimes on a collective level, the benefits may be greater than the individual benefits. Also, on the other hand, there may be negative externalities, of course, as I mentioned before. Second, I think it's very important that we don't only look at the aggregate well-being and the sum total of individual goods and well-being, but also at something like a fair distribution of these goods and advantages. They should be fairly distributed. And thirdly, I think it's also interesting to look at what I call here the social determinants of well-being, and that includes actually things like environmental factors, institutional arrangements, but also socio-cultural conditions that enable people to lead good lives that are conducive to well-being. I'll come back to that with an example. So if we look at these three aspects, I think that gives us three kind of entry points to assess and to look at what enhancement might mean for the public good. So I'll start with looking at this idea of the aggregate well-being as sum total of individual goods. And because we live in our Western societies, in pluralist societies where people have very different ideas about what the good life entails, so have different ideas of what might enhance their personal well-being, it is an obvious move that has been made in the literature to go and look at all-purpose goods. So these are the kind of things that are good for you and that will enhance your well-being regardless of what exact conception of good life you have. So in the literature there have been many proposals of these kind of all-purpose goods. For example, intelligence, self-discipline, empathy, honesty, imagination, not being shy, but eyesight, speed, ability to make friends, a sense of humor, and there's a whole longer list, all taken from published papers. Now, if I look at the list, I actually think that many of these things are not so very useful with regard to conceptions of a good life as proponents seem to think. I think, for example, not being shy is a typically present-day Western kind of value. It's not valued everywhere in the world, that you're not shy. Better eyesight, I think it's kind of doubtful whether that will really enhance your life, whatever your plans in life are. And I think there's more to say about the neutrality of most of these things. The second issue is that they're very complex traits, so it's, I think, questionable for a number of these things whether they will ever be able to really fine-tune them in a biological way. But perhaps the most important point I'd like to make here is that if you look at the kind of lists that philosophers and theories of the good life have listed as being all-purpose goods, and you also end up with things like respect or self-respect, rights, and freedoms. And these are not kind of individual things that you can just change by medically engineering the individual. It's much more a kind of social goods that we're talking about here. So Buchanan has also used this notion of all-purpose. What I would like to say here is that I think there's actually a limited amount of all-purpose goods that is really open to biomedical enhancement. And Buchanan lists a number of all-purpose goods that I kind of agree with. Compressed mobility, lifespan extension, increased immunity, and cognitive abilities. And he says that these are the things that are likely to be enhanceable in the near future and also are all-purpose goods. And he claims that these goods will, in the end, increase our well-being, our collective well-being, by increasing productivity. And he defines productivity rather broadly, I think. He says it is how good we are at using existing resources to create things we value. So that's very open to everything that we might value. But I also feel, unfortunately, in his book, he tends to interpret productivity in rather economic terms, and he tends to see it. You get the impression that in the end, the gross national product is the measure for collective well-being, and I think we should not go that way. I think we should be looking at much more richer notions of collective well-being, like something like flourishing or capability approach, things like that. Nevertheless, if we take this for now as a given, I think the first three are obviously very much related to health and are actually the things that we are already trying to improve and enhance in our regular healthcare system and in public health. So not really that controversial maybe. Cognitive abilities, I think, present an interesting example of how, if you look at that, those from a more collective point of view, you can see that it's not all about having the highest IQ and having this super intelligence as some kind of positional good, but that also small increases for everybody might in the end increase common welfare of the whole community. I think the example of IMAX implementation from Anders originally is a good example of that. And another way to go would be enhancing specific professional groups that do their work and enhance specific trades that enables them to do their work in the service of the community. There would be two other ways to look at this example. Now, of course, enhancing morality, we cannot escape this issue, it seems. So, actually, I must admit I'm quite skeptical about the possibilities here. I think there's no real agreement on what it would entail. Again, we're talking very, very complex abilities, at least we would like to fine-tune them in the ways that would probably be necessary to really make a difference. We might question here whether it would be possible to target certain specific groups. I'm thinking of people who are prone to aggression or criminal behavior. That is a discussion that is going on. But in the end, I think for most of the kind of problems that it has been proposed for, like solving global warming, also solving global poverty and things like that, I completely agree with John that I think that we need political and institutional changes and enhancements there, not so much biomedical enhancements of individuals. So I think that actually there's a rather limited number of truly all-purpose foods, and many important foods are actually not so much individual but rather social, and for the foreseeable future, probably biomedical enhancements for the public group will be very close to public health care or target specific groups. The second aspect of what I mentioned as containing or of the public good is that of justice or fairness. I'm not going to say very much about that, but I think that looking from this public good perspective, enhancement of justice becomes a much more prominent issue. I think justice then can be seen as a kind of goal of enhancement, creating a more just society, or at least that we should regulate enhancements in such a way that we do create a more just society. And it's not just some sort of side constraint on individual choices, but it is really one of the purposes of how we want to develop further enhancements and how we want to regulate. So this means not just not creating new unjust inequalities, not further increasing existing inequalities, and trying actually to decrease existing unjust inequalities. again, you might wonder whether biomedical changes are the most effective way to go here. But in any case, I think it does signal a need for some form of regulation or state intervention if we want to regulate enhancement in such a way that it will be conducive to justice, subsidize or limit access for certain groups. And finally, the social determinants of well-being. What I mean with that are the kind of social and environmental conditions that affect well-being of people and that are created and maintained collectively and cannot be changed by single individuals, kind of cultural thing. So, for example, our obesogenic society and an obesogenic environment, our fast food culture, these are all kind of cultural aspects that are, in a sense, not good for us. They make us fat, they make us unhealthy. We cannot single-handedly change these kind of environmental cultural conditions. Similarly, we could think of enhancement, what enhancement does to, as a more cultural kind of norm or culture of enhancement, as I've heard call it. That I mean the kind of culture that says there's a kind of a duty to always try to improve yourself, that you always should try to do better, that there's a competitiveness, individual responsibility, some kind of drive for optimization. That's a kind of cultural ethos, you could say. And there have been critiques in the literature that this kind of enhancement culture, this way of thinking, is in the end bad for us because it produces a lot of stress and anxiety for everybody to try to keep up, because it leads to a loss of self-respect and people that fail to do so, leads to a loss of solidarity, leads to a loss of inclusion, and also tends to medicalize all kinds of forms of inner performance. Of course, I think this culture of enhancement, you could also look at it from a quite different perspective. And I'm thinking here of Eric's two lenses. I think this is another lens through which you can see this enhancement culture. You could also say that it just implies a kind of openness to improvement, that it just admits that nobody's perfect, everybody is disabled in some way, so everybody is improvable. And that could actually create kind of new grounds for acceptance, for solidarity, and there would be no longer a real need for medicalization if you would just legitimize enhancement. You could just say, well, everybody needs some improvement somewhere. Well, what's the problem? We just share this together as a solidarity practice. So I think it's difficult for these kind of social determinants of well-being to judge which one of these two views is the correct one. It's partly empirical, but it's also partly a normative difference in view. So that makes it also very difficult, I think, to ask how we should take such kind of factors into account when we make social policy. I mean, can you influence them? Should you influence them? Or is it just up to society? That actually brings me to the last slide, and further challenges. Of course, I've now only tried to look into possible ways in which enhancement could be good for the collective or could be detrimental to it. Of course, a huge important issue is the potential conflict between state intervention for the public good. How far could that go without limiting individual freedom too much? So maybe we shouldn't even be speaking about prohibiting or enforcing certain enhancements, but I think we should be speaking about maybe stimulating some forms of enhancement or limiting some forms of enhancement, or, the kind of things we already do also in public health, for example, where we also talk about vaccination. We don't want to make it mandatory, but we want to have everybody to have access to it. So there's this conflict, potential conflict between the public good and individual freedom that I think we should try to manage. Second issue is the fact that of value pluralism, that in our societies people will not easily agree, will not easily reach some kind of consensus on what exactly this public good is. And I think that is also a call for more public involvement and more public deliberation in decision making about new biotechnologies. And that also means that we're better, or no longer at the realm of pure ethics, so to speak, more in that of politics and policy making, which I think is a slightly different context than what we had before. I think that is it.
Thank you very much, Claudia. We've got about 15 minutes of questions. Yes?
Thanks for this. So we brought up two issues on your last slide, and I was hoping we could talk a little more about the first issue. So the first issue was state intervention for public versus individual freedom. So there might be a class of cases where it's not a problem. So cases of when we have a violent offender. So we already kind of think that as a society it's okay to limit that individual's freedom. So maybe biotech in the criminal context might be at least one context where this isn't a problem. So, but I think I agree with you that overall.
I mean, it is a problem, and I just didn't go into it in this talk, but if you start to say that the public good or the collective good is a factor that might limit individual freedom in certain ways, then of course that's a very important issue to look into much detail. And I think we have to do that on a more case-by-case basis, and not on like it's never permitted, it's always permitted.
Did you have your hand up?
I was thinking about the state intervention and how is the state different from a voting machine? So it seems like most people would say the voting machine is kind of, it's not changing, it's not open, while a state is. In an open society, we can point out that something is wrong with how the state is going about things, and if there is enough support for that, we can change the rules of how the state applies this. Which is why most people are not too worried about the state, perhaps, even when it means something for the common good. But it seems that that could actually suggest a way out for Union and the vote machine. Maybe we can have an open and democratic vote machine. I don't know what your thoughts on this is.
Actually, I don't know. Well, of course, the vote machine works very differently. I mean, the whole idea of it changing your thoughts or making it impossible to even want to do certain things, that's absolutely not what is at stake when a government proposes certain measures to promote or limit accessibility for people. So the way it works in that way is different. I do think that one of the problems with the vote machine, I don't know who mentioned it earlier today, is that the question who makes up the rules that the vote machine is going to implement. And of course, if the vote machine would be this kind of democratic body, then maybe, I mean, that aspect at least would be different. I still hope that this democratic body will find that it would be allowed to change people's minds without them knowing it.
Well, this is an issue that I'm very interested in. In my presentation, talk about this issue as a background. My comment, my question is this: I don't know if this makes you rethink some issues or not, but is this Gerald Postman? I think he has written the best article on the distinction between collective values and common values. Others people wrote about that, but this I think this has a very good definition. Something can be a common value if it is aggregative, as you, for example, suggest. Illumination in this room is a common value for us, but it ceases to be a common value in this concept of Osterman if one of us does not be benefited by illumination. So common value is aggregative, perhaps a completely aggregative. But collective values, they think, is distinctive because it continues to be a value for us, even though there are persons, individuals here that are not benefited for that. For example, illumination. Illumination can be also collective and a common value for us. Environmental protection, for example, is a collective value because some people could be not really benefited by environmental protection, and it continues to be a collective value. My point is there is this distinction, and this distinction is important because some issues in public choice, in public sphere, are commonly valued and others are collectively valued, and the collective value are the most important. And the distinction is important because, as you said, that it's aggregative. I don't think this is truly aggregative.
Thank you. I think I just look into that some more. I think you also refer to something like a public good, which is also different from the public good. So there's a lot of conceptual difficulties here that I'm not really clear about myself. So thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, John?
Nigel, thank you for that. One thing that bothers me slightly is, while I understand and sympathise with your desire to remove sources of anxiety from we human beings, it does seem to me that this is not possible to do. We are, it seems to me, inveterate self-improvers, and for very good reasons. Because most of us have conceptions of ourselves, we know how we want to be, and we want to be more like we want to be. But also there's sort of very hardwired sorts of reasons. Self-improvement is getting better at hunting and gathering, and it's certainly getting better at mating. That is hardwired into us as it's possible at some point to do. So there are a whole list of things that we naturally want to improve our capacities to do, hunting, gathering, or what equivalent to that, getting employment, feeding our families, and then the other things that also need to derive satisfactions from both as individuals and as society, science, art, culture, activity. And all of these, of course, are also sources of anxiety. And the alternative to having these constant spurs to self-improvement in all of these areas is not necessarily attractive either. I mean, complacency and indolence. So I think we are just saddled by a complicated combination of our evolutionary history, our nature, and our preferences to be stuck with the enhancement imperative right across the board. I don't see how we're going to avoid it.
You seem to be saying now that some suffering and anxiety is necessary for us anyway.
Well, we want to minimize the suffering and anxiety, but not at the expense of our capacity to seek for and find.
Of course not. I agree with you. And I just think it's not that black and white, that it is either a choice for enhancing always everything to the maximum, or doing nothing and just, well, I don't know what you do if you do not just sit around and wait for things to happen. I mean, something in between, I think, should be sensible. I mean, people want improvements, you say. I think people different to the degree in which they do want to improve themselves. I do think that there is a difference in degree, again, in how, what kind of society you create. If there's a really strong imperative to always be better, then I'm not sure if that will create the most pleasant society.
It doesn't, but I mean, you listed, some of your list was improving cognitive ability, which you might have, just from human behavior, what you might have put is seeking increased attractiveness. It would be by patterns of consumers, probably even higher on the list than cognitive.
Yeah, just the other workshop somebody said that in America people want to enhance their physique, their athletic capacities, and in Europe or in Asia it's more in cognitive capacities.
Okay, we've got 3 more questions, and then we hit them over here.
Thank you for a lovely talk. If I understood, one of the reasons for
social value is human imperfection. But I think that we will probably agree that there is no perfect social or political system at all. It's more common than a question, but I'm interested in your opinion.
So what you're saying is there's no perfect social system? No, I think not. But there again, I think we want to improve things. And one of my points is that I think improving society is also done on a societal level and not merely on the individual level. We cannot merely change individual culture, also changing structures and improving.
Okay, Rob, short question, short answer.
So that was an interesting experience. I felt like I stood up there and raged against the evils of considering public good in the intensity debate. And then you said a whole lot of really sensible things about it that I agree with. I what's going on there. I guess one of the things I think is that you're underestimating the extent to which intuitions about individual good and social good can come apart in the enhancement debate, because people are willing to think so radically about how we should reshape individuals. So think about the neurodiversity literature and the emerging argument that it would be good for society if we had more people on the autism spectrum, because that would increase the amount of neurodiversity and that would be collective benefit. And now I think, I feel for the people who essentially have what in many circumstances will make their lives miserable for the thought that they might be the one person who affects society.
I agree, but 2 points. I think there's a lot more diversity in valuing these kind of states. A lot more than there is a diversity in valuing these kind of states that we now call disability, so it's not that easy. And the second is that I specifically mentioned something like justice, and perhaps we should expand on that, because it's not just equitable well-being. And if you say there's a just minimum that everybody has a right to attend, then you cannot sacrifice them first for the rest of us. So something we can get right.
Okay, last question. Sorry, are you actually Alexander? I thought I recognized you. Please.
I enjoyed the presentation. I was interested in your mention of potentially enhancing specific groups that would have especially beneficial impacts. Actually, I'm going to address that in my presentation tomorrow. But I would be interested if you had a more specific picture of this, how this would happen, because, for instance, you could have two scenarios. You could have one where some select groups have access to some enhancement of the rest of the population is not, it's forbidden, or an alternative would be everyone has access to it, but these select groups have special access, like there's funding, that there's extra funds made available to ensure that they have access to it. If you have a specific scenario in mind, you could think there are these raises social justice issues.
I did not really have any specific scenario in mind. I think the two that you mentioned are both possible, and I think it would again depend on the exact announcement that we're talking about. Could be very dangerous, for example. That could be a reason to prohibit it for most people, but have some special groups that are willing or required to take these risks by way of their profession, as we now ask military personnel to take huge risks that we would ask other people in society. So something.
All right, thank you very much, Martin. We're finished for today. I have no idea when we're going to start tomorrow. I have no idea what the dinner is. So what you're going to do.
Here I am to solve all the problems. Let me say first something about the garbage versus so we're going now to have dinner. Those who have a voucher for the cruise and dinner will be escorted by cars to the place from which the ship will start its tour. And tomorrow, from where we start at 9 o'clock, so I suppose 9 o'clock. So we're going down there. Just written out.